Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Along the ancient trade routes that wound from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, merchants carried more than just precious amber. They carried whispers of a people whose name would one day make emperors tremble. The Romans called them Gothi. They called themselves Gutans. History remembers them as the conquerors who toppled an empire. But their story begins not with swords and fire, but with ships creaking across cold northern waters, and children learning their first words in a language that would one day be spoken in the halls of Roman palaces. Tonight, we will trace the extraordinary transformation of the Goths from their disputed origins in the forests and islands of the north to their ultimate destiny as the inheritors of Rome itself. We'll walk with them across frozen rivers and burning cities, stand beside their kings as they negotiate with emperors, and witness how a people once dismissed as barbarians created kingdoms that would define the medieval world. This is a story of survival against impossible odds, of adaptation without losing identity, and of how the supposed destroyers of civilization became its unexpected preservers. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into the mists of the 1st century AD, where the Baltic Sea crashes against rocky shores and dense forests stretch endlessly southward, where amber glows like captured sunlight in traders' hands, and where our story begins, not with certainty, but with mystery. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in 98 AD, mentioned them only briefly. The Gotones, he called them, a people living somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, beyond the Germanic tribes that Rome had fought for generations. They were ruled by kings, he noted, somewhat more strictly than their neighbours, and they were known for their round shields, their short swords, and their particular devotion to their rulers. But where did they come from? This question has haunted historians for nearly 2,000 years. Picture the Baltic coast on a winter morning. Ice crystals hang in the air like suspended diamonds. The sea, when it isn't frozen solid, moves in slow, dark swells that seem to breathe with ancient memory. Somewhere along these shores, perhaps on the island of Gotland, perhaps in what is now southern Sweden, perhaps at the mouth of the Vistula River in modern Poland, the Gothic story begins. The amber washing up on these beaches, formed from prehistoric forests drowned millions of years ago, would become their first connection to the wider world. Roman merchants would follow the amber road north, seeking this golden resin that wealthy Roman women wore as jewellery and that some believed could cure ailments. And with these merchants came the first written glimpses of the Gothic peoples. But the Goths themselves told a different story of their origins. According to their own traditions, preserved in the 6th century by the Gothic historian Jordanes, they came from an island called Scanza, somewhere in the far north. Under a king named Berig, they crossed the sea in only 3 ships, landing on the southern shores of the Baltic. Think about that image for a moment. 3 ships, carrying perhaps a few hundred people at most, the founding population of a people who would one day rule from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. Whether this is history or foundation myth, it captures something essential about Gothic self-perception. They saw themselves as travellers, as a people in motion, carrying their identity with them like a torch that could be lit wherever they made camp. The archaeological evidence tells a more complex story. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, a new culture appears along the lower Vistula River, in what is now Poland. Archaeologists call it the wheelbark culture, and it seems to represent a fusion, a blending of local populations with newcomers who brought distinctive burial practices. These people didn't bury weapons with their dead. Unlike their Germanic neighbours, they practiced both cremation and inhumation. They crafted distinctive brooches and ornaments that would later appear, modified but recognisable, across half of Europe, Was this the archaeological footprint of those 3 ships from Skansa? Or was it something more gradual, more complex, a slow coalescence of various groups into what would become the Gothic people? The wheelbark culture gives us our first tangible glimpses of Gothic life. Their settlements clustered along rivers, modest villages of wooden longhouses with sunken floors and central hearths. Smoke from cooking fires would have hung in the rafters, mixing with the smell of leather, wool, and the ever-present scent of the forest. Children would have grown up to the sound of smiths hammering iron, women singing at their looms, and elders recounting genealogies that stretched back to gods and heroes. The archaeological remains show us a people who were prosperous, but not ostentatious, who valued craftsmanship, but didn't display wealth in death, who maintained traditions, but were willing to adapt and change. Echoes from Skansa. The island of Gotland rises from the Baltic Sea like a limestone dream, its coasts riddled with caves, and its interior dotted with ancient stone monuments. Today, Swedish farmers still plough up Roman coins from their fields. More Roman gold and silver has been found on Gotland than anywhere else outside the former Roman Empire. These coins tell us something profound about connections between this northern island and the Gothic peoples who would eventually shape European history. Jordanes, writing in Constantinople around 550 AD, claimed to draw on older Gothic histories, now lost to us. He described Skansa as a great island in the Northern Ocean, shaped like a juniper leaf, with deep bays and high mountains. From this island, he wrote, came many nations, and among them the Goths, who emerged from its interior like bees from a hive. Modern scholars debate whether Skansa refers to the Scandinavian peninsula, the island of Gotland specifically, or represents a mythologized homeland that may have combined memories of various northern territories. The linguistic evidence offers tantalizing clues. The Gothic language, preserved for us primarily through Bishop Wulfula's 4th century Bible translation, belongs to the East Germanic branch of the Germanic language family. It shares features with Old Norse that suggest ancient connections, words for fundamental concepts like kinship, warfare, and the sacred that echo across the Baltic Sea. When Gothic priests in 4th century Dacia spoke of Guth, meaning God, their word resonated with the Old Norse Guth and the Proto-Germanic Guthas. These linguistic fossils suggest shared origins in the deep past, though they cannot tell us precisely when or how the separation occurred. Consider what it might have meant to leave Skansa, if indeed that memory preserves historical truth. Picture the preparation, families gathering their possessions, livestock being herded onto wooden ships, precious seeds, carefully wrapped in leather pouches to plant in unknown soil. The old and weak might have stayed behind, knowing they would never see their kin again. The sea journey, whether across the narrow waters to the southern Baltic coast or a longer voyage, would have been treacherous. These were not Viking longships of later centuries, but smaller, simpler vessels, fighting through ice floes and autumn storms. The Goths themselves maintained elaborate genealogies, linking their royal families back to divine ancestors in the north. The Amal dynasty of the Ostrogoths traced their lineage to Gapt, born of the gods themselves. The Visigothic Balthi dynasty claimed descent from the bold, the brave ones who had led their people to greatness. These genealogies served political purposes, certainly, but they also preserved memories, however transformed, of northern origins. Even centuries later, when Goths ruled in Spain and Italy, they remembered that they came from somewhere else, that they were inherently a people of the journey. Archaeological connections between Scandinavia and the wheelbark culture are subtle but significant. Certain brooch types, specific pottery decorations, and burial customs show similarities that suggest contact and shared traditions. But archaeology also shows us that the Gothic peoples, whoever they were and wherever they originated, were synthesizers from the very beginning. They took local traditions and made them their own. They adopted and adapted, maintaining a Gothic identity while transforming everything they touched. The Roman writer Ptolemy, creating his geography in the 2nd century AD, placed the Githons, clearly Goths, at the mouth of the Vistula River. By this time, they were already known to Roman geographers, already part of the mental map of the world beyond the empire's frontiers. They controlled the southeastern Baltic coast, sitting at the nexus of trade routes that connected the Roman world with the vast interior of Europe and the mysterious lands of the north. Amber, furs, slaves, and stories flowed through Gothic hands. The Vistula sojourn. You are 8 winters old, and the morning frost crunches beneath your bare feet as you run from the longhouse to the river. Your breath forms clouds in the air that the rising sun turns to gold. Your mother calls after you in the old tongue, telling you not to go far, that there is work to be done. But for just this moment, you are free to stand at the water's edge and watch the mist rise from the Vistula's dark surface, like the spirits your grandmother speaks of in her stories. Your village sits on a low rise above the floodplain, perhaps 24 longhouses arranged around a central space where the elders meet and where festivals are held. The houses are built of oak timbers, their walls filled with wattle and daub, their roofs thick with thatch that must be replaced every few years. Inside your home, the fire never dies. It smoulders through the night, carefully tended, ready to be coaxed back to life each morning. The smoke has blackened the rafters where herbs hang drying, where tools are stored, where the household spirits are said to dwell. Your father is a craftsman, a worker of iron and bronze. You love to watch him at his forge, the way the metal glows like a living thing, the way he knows exactly when to strike and when to wait. He makes brooches that hold cloaks, closed against the winter wind, knife blades that hold their edge through seasons of use, and occasionally, when someone can afford it, something beautiful, something that serves no purpose but to catch the light and please the eye. He has been teaching you to recognize good iron ore, to understand the colors of heated metal, to respect the fire that can create and destroy with equal ease. Your mother and sisters work wool from morning until night. When they aren't tending the gardens or preserving food for winter, the sound of the loom is the heartbeat of your home, the rhythmic thump and click as threads become cloth. You have already learned to spin, your small fingers twisting wool into thread, though yours is still lumpy and uneven compared to your mother's perfectly consistent strands. The cloth your family makes isn't just for your own use. Some of it will be traded at the seasonal gatherings, exchanged for things your village cannot produce. Salt from the coast, special stones for grinding grain, and occasionally, rare treasures from the south, from the Roman world that seems as distant and magical as the old stories. You know every tree in the forest around your village, every stream, every clearing where berries grow in summer. You know where the wolves den, where the wild boar root for acorns, where the best mushrooms appear after autumn rains. The forest is not just a place of resources, but a place of power, where the gods walk, where offerings are left at sacred groves, where young men go alone to seek visions and return as warriors. Your uncle disappeared into the forest for 3 days last winter and came back changed, marked with new scars and carrying a new name that only the initiated can speak. The rhythms of your life follow the seasons. Spring brings flooding to the river valley, fertilizing the fields, but also bringing disease and danger. Summer is for growing, for long days in the fields, for gathering wild foods, for raids and trading expeditions to distant places. Autumn is the season of harvest and preparation, when every hand is needed to bring in the grain, to slaughter the animals that won't survive the winter, to smoke meat and store roots in deep pits. Winter is the time of stories, of craftwork by firelight, of ceremonies that bind the community together against the dark and cold. Death is always close in your world. You have already lost 2 siblings, one to fever, one to an accident at the river. The cemetery lies just outside the village, a field of low mounds and occasional standing stones. Your people don't bury weapons with the dead. Unlike the neighbouring tribes who your elders sometimes speak of with suspicion, sometimes with admiration. Instead, the dead are sent on their journey with pottery vessels containing food, with personal ornaments, with tools they might need in the other world. Some are burned on pyres, their ashes collected in urns. Others are laid in the earth intact, positioned carefully, facing the rising sun. You are learning the stories that define your people. Stories of the crossing, when your ancestors came from the island in the north. Stories of kings who could trace their bloodlines back to gods. Stories of heroes who fought monsters and won kingdoms. But you are also learning new stories brought by traders from the south. Stories of an empire where buildings are made of stone, where men fight in organized formations wearing identical armor, where wine flows like water, and where writing can capture words and hold them forever. These stories seem impossible, like dreams or lies, but the traders bring proof. Coins with faces on them, glass vessels that seem to hold light within them, swords of steel that never rust. Your world is changing, though you don't fully understand it yet. More people are moving through your territory, some staying, some passing through to lands further south. The elders argue about whether to welcome them or drive them away. New gods are being whispered about, gods who demand different sacrifices, different observances. The climate itself seems to be shifting, winters growing harsher, forcing people to move or adapt. You are living at a hinge point in history, though to you it is simply life, simply the way things are and have always been. Rivers and destinies. The clan leader Alaric, though this was not yet his name, for the Goths would not bear Roman names for generations yet, stood where the Vistula met the sea, and knew that his decision would echo through the bloodlines of his people forever. Behind him, 300 souls waited, warriors with their round shields and short swords, women with children clutched against them, elders who remembered when the world was different, young men eager for glory, and young women wondering what kind of life awaited them beyond the horizon. The signs had been clear for 3 seasons now. The winters grew longer and more bitter each year. The hunting grounds that had sustained their fathers and grandfathers yielded less game. Most troubling of all, new peoples pressed from the north and east, fierce fighters who spoke strange tongues and worshipped unknown gods. The clan could stay and fight for diminishing resources, or they could move. But moving meant abandoning the graves of their ancestors, the sacred groves where they had made offerings since time immemorial, the very soil that defined who they were. He had consulted the priests, those who could read the flight of birds and the patterns in sacrificial blood. He had sought dreams at the holy springs, fasting until visions came. He had even, and this was a secret he would take to his grave, consulted with a Roman trader who had told him of rich lands to the south, lands along a great river called the Danube, where the soil was black and fertile, where the climate was milder, where a strong people could carve out a kingdom. The debate had raged for months in the clan assembly. The young warriors spoke of glory and conquest, of testing themselves against new enemies, of winning wealth and fame. The elders spoke of caution, of the dangers of unknown lands, of the anger of the gods if they abandoned the old ways. The women, when they were consulted, and among the Goths they were consulted on such matters, spoke of practical things. Would there be good water? Would the children survive the journey? Would they be welcomed or feared in new lands? In the end, it was the children who decided him. He watched his own son, barely old enough to hold a practice sword, playing at war with the other boys. What future awaited him here? A life of gradually increasing hardship, of fighting over scraps, of watching the clans slowly diminish, until they were absorbed by stronger peoples, or simply faded away, or the chance, however dangerous, of something greater. The journey south would take them through territories controlled by other tribes, some friendly, some hostile. They would need to negotiate passage, possibly fight for it. They would need to find food along the way, keep the livestock alive, protect the vulnerable, and at the end, they would need to either find empty land or take it from whoever currently held it. Every step was fraught with danger, but standing still meant certain, slow death. He thought of the stories of their ancestors, of Berig, who had led their people across the sea from Skanza. If Berig could bring their people to a new land with only 3 ships, surely Alaric could lead his clan to better territory. The comparison gave him courage, connected his decision to the mythic past, transformed a desperate migration into another chapter in the Gothic saga of movement and adaptation, the Black Sea transformation. By the year 200 AD, the Gothic peoples had spread across an enormous territory, stretching from the Vistula to the Black Sea, a migration that had taken perhaps 3 or 4 generations, but had transformed them from a Baltic people into masters of the Pontic steppe. This vast grassland, where the earth meets the sky in an endless horizon, would become the crucible in which the Gothic Confederation was forged. The archaeology of this period reveals a remarkable culture that scholars call Chernyakov, named after a village in Ukraine where it was first identified. This wasn't simply Gothic culture transplanted to new soil, but something unprecedented, a multi-ethnic synthesis that included Goths, Sarmatians, Dacians, and others, all bound together in a complex confederation that maintained distinct identities while sharing material culture, trade networks, and military organization. Picture settlements stretching along the rivers that flow into the Black Sea, the Dniester, the Bug, the Dnieper, each one a node in a network that connected the forest zone to the steppe, the Roman frontier, to the depths of Scythia. The Goths had learned from the horsemen of the steppe, adopting cavalry tactics that would later terrorize Roman legions. They had learned from Sarmatian metalworkers, creating a distinctive style of polychrome jewelry that combined Germanic animal art with steppe traditions of inlaid garnets and coloured glass. They had learned from Greek cities along the Black Sea coast, absorbing elements of classical culture that would later flower in unexpected ways. You could walk through a Gothic settlement of this period and hear half a dozen languages being spoken, see clothing styles from across Eurasia, smell foods, cooking that combined ingredients and techniques from forest, steppe, and sea. The transformation went deeper than material culture. The Goths were developing new forms of political organization, confederations led by judges and kings who could coordinate the actions of multiple tribes across vast distances. They were creating what Romans would later call the Gothic peoples, though they themselves recognized divisions that outsiders could barely perceive. The Tervingi and Gruthungi, the Vezi and the Ostrogothi, each with their own traditions, their own royal lines, their own claims to preeminence. Consider what this meant for a Gothic warrior of this period. Your grandfather might have been a farmer along the Vistula, knowing only a few dozen miles of forest and river valley. You yourself might range across territories larger than modern countries, fighting alongside Sarmatian horsemen against Roman garrisons, trading with Greek merchants in Crimean ports, learning the politics of the steppe, where alliances shifted like grass in the wind. Your identity was becoming something new, not purely the ancestral traditions of the north, but Gothic nonetheless. Perhaps more consciously Gothic, because you now knew what you were not. The steppe taught harsh lessons. Here, mobility was survival. A people who couldn't move quickly, whether to pursue enemies or escape them, would be destroyed or absorbed. The Goths learned to organize their society for movement, with wagons that could carry entire households, with social structures that could function whether concentrated in one place or spread across hundreds of miles. They learned the delicate balance of pastoralism and agriculture, when to sow and when to move, how to exploit different ecological zones in different seasons. The Black Sea became their highway to wealth and knowledge. Gothic raiders and traders, the line between the two was often thin, sailed these waters in vessels that combined northern shipbuilding traditions with Mediterranean techniques. They struck at Roman cities along the coast, not just for plunder, but for prisoners who could teach them Roman skills: engineering, administration, and the arts of civilization. Some of these captives, particularly educated Greeks, would become influential in Gothic society, helping to create the synthetic culture that would later produce Gothic kingdoms that were both barbarian and Roman. The material remains from this period speak of prosperity and cultural confidence. Pottery produced in Gothic settlements shows remarkable standardization across huge distances, suggesting organized production and distribution networks. Metalworking reached new heights of sophistication, with Gothic smiths producing everything from agricultural tools to elaborate military equipment. Glass beads and vessels, either imported or produced locally using Roman techniques, appear in even modest burials. This was not a society barely surviving on the edges of civilization, but one that was thriving, growing, and developing its own distinctive character. But perhaps most significantly, this was when the Goths began to see themselves as a people with a destiny. The stories told around their fires now included not just the ancient tales of Scanza and divine ancestors, but new chapters of conquest and transformation. They had travelled farther than their ancestors could have imagined, achieved things that would have seemed impossible to their grandparents, and they were just beginning. To the south lay the Roman Empire, the greatest power the world had ever known. But the Goths had learned that even empires could bleed. Language of the Thunderer, in the sacred groves where the Goths made their offerings, where ancient oaks stood like pillars holding up the sky, the old words had power. Thunder was not merely thunder, but thuns, the voice of the god whose hammer struck the clouds. The runes, carved into wood and stone, were not just marks, but sacred signs that could bind oaths, curse enemies, and invoke divine protection. The Gothic language, as it was spoken in these early centuries, was a thing of harsh beauty, all gutturals and fierce aspirations that seemed to echo the landscape of dark forests and wide rivers. When a Gothic warrior boasted of his victories, the words themselves seemed to ring like sword on shield. When a Gothic mother sang lullabies to her children, the ancient melodies carried memories of northern seas and winter nights when the spirits walked close to the world of men. We know this language primarily through a miracle of preservation, the Gothic Bible translated in the 4th century by Bishop Wulfila. But here, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Gothic was still a purely oral tongue, a language that lived in memory and breath, passed from parent to child like a sacred flame. The poets, the skalds as their northern cousins would call them, were the libraries of their people, carrying in their memories thousands of lines of genealogy, hero tales, and sacred formulas. Picture a gathering on a winter night, the entire clan assembled in the largest hall, fires burning bright against the darkness outside. The eldest scold rises, and silence falls like snow. He begins to speak, and his words are not just words but invocations, summoning the ancestors to witness, calling the gods to attention. He tells of Gaut, the divine progenitor, of ancient kings who won their thrones through valour and wisdom, of battles where the fate of peoples was decided. The rhythms of his speech are hypnotic, alliterative verses that seem to pulse with their own life, easier to remember than to forget. First blood on Roman soil. The year 238 AD marked a turning point that would reshape the ancient world, though few recognized it at the time. Gothic warriors, for the first time in recorded history, crossed the Danube in force and struck deep into Roman territory. The empire that had seemed invincible, that had conquered from Britain to Mesopotamia, suddenly found its northern frontier aflame. The Gothic force that crossed the frozen Danube that winter was not the disorganized barbarian horde that Roman propaganda would later describe. These were disciplined fighters who had learned the arts of war from multiple traditions. They moved in coordinated groups, their cavalry screening the advance, their infantry maintaining formation, even over difficult terrain. They had studied Roman tactics, learned from captives and deserters how the legions fought where they were strong and where they could be beaten. The first Roman city to fall was Histria on the Black Sea coast, an ancient Greek foundation that had been under Roman protection for centuries. The Gothic attack came at dawn, their warriors emerging from the morning mist like spirits of vengeance. The small garrison, mostly auxiliary troops, never stood a chance. But what happened next showed that this was more than just a raid. The Goths didn't simply plunder and burn. They systematically stripped the city of everything useful: tools, weapons, stored grain, and most importantly, people with skills. Blacksmiths, engineers, scribes, anyone who could contribute to Gothic society was taken north. Word of Histria's fall spread along the frontier like wildfire. The Roman governor of Moesia, caught completely off guard, scrambled to organize a defense. But the Goths were already moving, not as a single massive force, but as multiple coordinated groups that struck simultaneously at different points. One force besieged Marcianopolis, another raided deep into Thrace, a third swept along the coast taking ship after ship, learning as they went the arts of naval warfare. The emperor, Gordian III, barely in his teens, dispatched legions from Syria to meet the threat. But by the time they arrived, the Goths had vanished back across the Danube, taking with them wealth that would transform their society and knowledge, that would make future invasions even more dangerous. They had learned that Rome could be hurt, that the eternal empire was not so eternal after all. The Roman response was telling. Instead of launching punitive expeditions across the Danube, they began paying subsidies to Gothic leaders, essentially protection money to prevent future raids. This gold flowed north, funding the expansion of Gothic power, allowing their kings to reward followers and attract new allies. The empire, that had once made the world tremble, was now paying tribute to peoples it had previously dismissed as barbarians. The Danube Covenant. The great river flows eastward for nearly 2,000 miles, gathering waters from the heart of Europe before emptying into the Black Sea. In the 3rd century, this was not just a river but a boundary between worlds, between the ordered realm of Rome and the fluid territories of the Gothic peoples. Along its banks, in the hours before dawn when mist rises from the water like the breath of sleeping gods, you could stand and feel the weight of history gathering. The willows trail their branches in the current, whispering secrets in the wind. Herons stand motionless in the shallows, waiting for fish to forget caution. On the Roman side, watchtowers pierce the mist at regular intervals, each one within sight of the next, a chain of vigilance stretching from the Black Forest to the Black Sea. The soldiers manning these towers, many of them Germans themselves, auxiliaries from tribes that had submitted to Rome generations ago, watch the northern bank with experienced eyes. They know the signs, unusual movements of deer that suggest human presence, smoke from fires where no settlements should be, the absence of normal activity that might herald a gathering of warriors. On the Gothic side, the landscape seems less ordered, but no less watched. Hidden scouts observe the Roman positions, noting patterns, identifying weaknesses. Children playing by the riverside grow up knowing that the far bank represents both danger and opportunity, a world of stone buildings and written laws, of wine and silk, but also of legions that could destroy entire peoples. Yet for years at a time, the river could be a bridge as much as a barrier. Trading posts grew up at crossing points where Gothic, amber, and furs were exchanged for Roman coins and manufactured goods. Gothic nobles sent their sons south to serve in Roman armies, learning the arts of empire. Roman merchants ventured north, some settling in Gothic territories, teaching new crafts, spreading new ideas. Intermarriage happened, creating families with feet in both worlds. Children who could speak both Gothic and Latin, who sacrificed to both old gods and new. The treaties signed between Gothic kings and Roman emperors were more than political documents. They were recognitions of a new reality, that the Goths were no longer merely another barbarian tribe to be conquered or contained, but a power that had to be negotiated with, as equals. The annual subsidies Rome paid were formally gifts, but everyone understood them as the price of peace. A peace that allowed both sides to prosper, to prepare, to watch each other across the flowing waters and plan for futures that might bring alliance or war. When the Huns came, the year 375 AD changed everything. From the endless grasslands of Central Asia came a people unlike any the Goths had encountered before. The Huns moved across the steppe like a force of nature, their compound bows singing death from distances that seemed impossible, their horses carrying them faster than news of their coming. They were not interested in negotiation or gradual conquest. They came like a storm, and like a storm, they destroyed everything in their path. Alaric, king of the Greuthungi Goths, ruled a kingdom that stretched from the Black Sea to the Baltic, the greatest Gothic power that had ever existed. He had spent decades building this realm, binding together Goths, Alans, Slavs, and others through a combination of military might and careful diplomacy. His treasury held Roman gold and Sassanid silver. His armies could field tens of thousands of warriors. He thought himself secure, powerful enough to face any threat. He was wrong. The first Gothic settlements to encounter the Huns simply ceased to exist. There were no survivors to carry warnings, no refugees to tell what had happened, just empty villages, smoke rising from burned buildings, and the terrible silence that follows absolute destruction. Then the refugees began to arrive from the east, Hellenic peoples who had faced the Huns and fled, bringing stories that seemed impossible. Warriors who could shoot arrows backward, from galloping horses with deadly accuracy. Armies that moved faster than any force should be able to move. Leaders who drank from cups made from the skulls of their enemies. Picture the Gothic councils trying to make sense of these reports. These were people who understood warfare, who had fought Romans, Sarmatians, and each other for generations. But the Huns represented something outside their experience. The Gothic way of war, built around infantry shield walls, supported by cavalry, required set-piece battles, where courage and discipline determined victory. The Hunnic way of war avoided such confrontations entirely, striking where the enemy was weak, vanishing when they were strong, wearing down opponents through exhaustion and terror. Alaric tried to organize resistance. He gathered his forces, called on all his subject peoples, prepared to meet this threat with the full might of his kingdom. But how do you fight an enemy that refuses to give battle? The Huns struck at the edges of his realm, pulling back when Gothic armies approached, then striking somewhere else entirely. They turned Alaric's strength, the vast size of his kingdom, into weakness. He couldn't be everywhere at once. Every victory against the Huns was meaningless because they simply reformed elsewhere. Every defeat was catastrophic because it encouraged subject peoples to rebel or flee. The psychological impact was as devastating as the military defeats. The Goths had seen themselves as the masters of the northern world, the people who had made Rome pay tribute. Now they were the ones being mastered, and by a people they considered barely human. Gothic warriors, who had never known defeat, found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't even force to fight. The stories grew worse with each telling. Huns, who could ride for days without rest, who ate raw meat tenderized under their saddles, who had no homes but lived their entire lives on horseback. As Hunnic pressure increased, Gothic society began to fracture. Some groups wanted to stand and fight, believing that Gothic courage could overcome any enemy. Others argued for accommodation, perhaps serving the Huns as other peoples had served the Goths. But increasingly, the conversation turned to flight. Where could they go? North meant returning to lands they had left generations ago, now occupied by other peoples. East was where the Huns came from. West meant the territories of other Gothic groups, already under pressure. South, across the Danube, lay the Roman Empire. The death of Alaric, by suicide according to some sources, by Hunnic swords according to others, marked the end of Gothic independence north of the Danube. His kingdom fragmented instantly. The Greuthungi split, some submitting to Hunnic rule, others fleeing west to join their Tervingi cousins. The carefully constructed confederation that had taken generations to build dissolved in months. Gothic groups that had been united now competed desperately for diminishing safe territories. Among the Tervingi, the Western Goths, the judge Alaric tried to organize a defense. He ordered the construction of a wall between the Prut and Danube rivers, a desperate attempt to create a barrier against the Hunnic tide. But walls mean nothing to an enemy that can simply go around them. As Hunnic raids penetrated deeper into Tervingi territory, burning villages and carrying off prisoners, the pressure for a radical solution grew unbearable. It was Fritigern, Athanaric's rival, who first seriously proposed what had been unthinkable, asking Rome for sanctuary. The empire that had been the enemy could become salvation. But at what cost? To cross the Danube as suppliants meant abandoning not just territory, but independence. It meant submitting to Roman law, Roman authority, perhaps Roman gods. For a people who had defined themselves in opposition to Rome, it was a form of death. But with the Huns approaching, it might be the only alternative to literal death. The debates that raged in Gothic assemblies that summer of 376 AD were about more than military strategy. They were about identity, about what it meant to be Gothic. Could they maintain their culture within Roman borders? Would their children grow up Roman or Goth? Was survival worth the price of submission? The arguments grew so fierce that violence broke out between factions. Families divided. Warriors who had fought side by side now viewed each other as traitors. As autumn approached and Hunnic attacks intensified, the decision could no longer be postponed. Thousands of Gothic families gathered on the northern bank of the Danube, their possessions loaded on wagons, their livestock herded together, their warriors maintaining desperate vigilance against Hunnic raids. Across the river, Roman guards watched from their towers, unsure whether they were witnessing an invasion or a migration, whether these Goths were enemies or refugees, whether this moment marked Rome's triumph over an old foe or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Fritigern's gambit. You stand among 40,000 of your people on the northern bank of the Danube in the late summer of 376 AD. The river, swollen with mountain snowmelt, moves past like flowing iron under the grey September sky. Your clothes are travel-stained, your possessions reduced to what you could carry or load on a single wagon. Behind you, smoke rises from the lands you've abandoned, whether from Hunnic raids or from Gothic hands destroying what they couldn't take. You no longer know or care. Your children press close to you, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The youngest has been crying for days, asking when you'll go home. You have no answer that wouldn't break your heart to speak. Your spouse stands rigid beside you, maintaining dignity despite exhaustion, despite hunger, despite the humiliation of what you're about to do. Around you, the cream of Gothic society is likewise reduced to desperation. Noble ladies wearing their entire jewellery collection because it's easier than carrying it. Warriors who've never bent the knee to anyone preparing to beg. Elderly priests clutching sacred objects saved from profane temples. Fritigern moves through the crowd, speaking words of encouragement, promising that this is temporary, that Gothic strength will endure even within Roman borders. You want to believe him? He negotiated this crossing, convinced the Roman Emperor Valens to accept the Tervingi as foederati, allied troops who would defend the empire in exchange for land and food. It sounded reasonable when explained in council. Now, facing the reality of Roman soldiers controlling whether your family lives or dies, it feels like surrender. The Romans have sent officials to manage the crossing. They stand on the southern bank with their lists and regulations, their translators and tax collectors. Even from here, you can see their disgust, their fear, their greed as they look at your people. To them, you're not the proud Gothic nation that made emperors tremble. You're barbarians, useful perhaps, but certainly not equals. The way they look at your children makes your hand move instinctively to your knife, though you know drawing it would mean death. The crossing begins at dawn. Roman boats, too few for the task, begin ferrying people across. Each trip takes forever. Families are separated as officials decide who crosses when. Your warrior uncle is taken first, disarmed before boarding. They take his sword, the one his father carried, the one that should have passed to his son. You watch his face as he hands it over. See something die in his eyes. The Romans promise the weapons will be returned once you're settled. Everyone knows this is a lie. You wait through the morning, through the afternoon, as the sun beats down and your water runs low. Children cry. The elderly collapse. Pregnant women go into labour on the riverbank. Still, the process continues with maddening slowness. You begin to understand this is deliberate. The Romans want you desperate, want you grateful for whatever scraps they choose to throw. They're breaking your spirit before you even set foot on their soil. When your turn finally comes, a Roman official demands payment. But you've already given everything of value to Fritigern's negotiations. He eyes your daughter, pretty despite the dirt and exhaustion. The implication is clear. You feel rage rise in your throat like bile. Other Gothic warriors are watching, hands moving to hidden weapons. This could explode into violence that would see you all slaughtered. Your spouse steps forward, pulls off an arm ring. The last piece of family wealth, a treasure that should have been your daughter's dowry. The official takes it with a smirk, waves you toward the boat. The vessel is overcrowded, riding low in the water. You hold your children tight as it wallows across the current. Halfway across, you look back at the northern shore, at the lands that have been Gothic for generations. You will never see them again. None of you will. Even if you could return, they wouldn't be Gothic anymore. The Huns have seen to that. You look forward to the southern shore, to the Roman Empire that will be your home, your prison, perhaps your grave. As your feet touch Roman soil, you're herded into a temporary camp. A sea of makeshift shelters surrounded by Roman guards. The promised food is nowhere to be seen. Instead, Roman merchants appear, offering mouldy bread for gold, dog meat for jewelry. Your people, starving after weeks of flight, trade away their last treasures for food that Romans wouldn't feed to slaves. You watch noble Gothic women prostituting themselves for bread to feed their children. See proud warriors weeping with rage and shame. This is Fritigern's gambit. That Gothic resilience can survive even this humiliation, that from this lowest point your people can rise again, that the Romans in their arrogance are admitting not broken refugees, but a force that will transform their empire. You pray to gods both old and new that he's right, because if he's wrong, if this is simply the slow death of your people, then the Huns would have been more merciful. The field of Adrianople, August 9th, 378 AD. The morning sun already burns hot over the Thracian plains, promising a day that will be remembered for 1,000 years. Emperor Valens, resplendent in purple and gold, surveys his legions arranged in traditional battle formation. 15,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, veterans of Persian wars, guardians of civilization. Before them, a Gothic wagon circle on a low hill, perhaps 10,000 warriors behind a rampart of carts and desperate courage. The emperor smiles. After 2 years of Gothic rebellion, of burned cities and ravaged provinces, today he will end it. But Valens doesn't know what the Gothic scouts have seen. Dust clouds on the horizon, moving fast. He doesn't know that Fritigern has been stalling, sending peace envoys, not from desire for terms but to buy time. Most crucially, he doesn't know that Gothic warfare has evolved in 2 years of desperate fighting. These are not the same Goths who crossed the Danube as suppliants. These are survivors of Roman betrayal, students of Roman tactics, and they have learned lessons written in blood. The battle begins conventionally enough. Roman skirmishers advance, loosing arrows and javelins at the wagon fort. Gothic warriors huddle behind their makeshift walls, occasionally rising to hurl back spears or curses. The Roman infantry begins its inexorable advance, shields locked, the machine of empire grinding forward. They have taken such positions 100 times before. The barbarians always break when the shields reach their walls. Then the Gothic cavalry appears. They come from the east, where they've been hidden by terrain and distance. Thousands of horsemen, not just Goths, but Alans, and even some Huns who have joined the rebellion. They strike the Roman left flank like a thunderbolt. The Roman cavalry, outnumbered and caught off guard, disintegrates. Within minutes, the Gothic horse is rolling up the Roman line, driving into the unprotected sides of the legendary legions. Picture the Roman soldier in the ranks, trained for frontal combat, suddenly attacked from the side. Your shield, so effective against enemies in front, is useless against the horseman driving a lance into your ribs. Your formation, your greatest strength, becomes a trap as you're pressed against your comrades, unable to maneuver, unable to even fall when struck. The discipline that has conquered the world becomes a liability as units maintain formation even as they're being slaughtered. From the wagon fort, Gothic infantry pours out, Fritigern himself in the lead. They strike the Roman front, just as the cavalry hits the flanks. A perfectly coordinated assault that speaks to sophisticated planning and communication. These Gothic warriors fight with captured Roman equipment, using Roman techniques, but powered by 2 years of rage at Roman betrayal. They remember the crossing, the starvation, the children who died from Roman neglect, the women violated by Roman officials. This is not just battle but vengeance. The Roman centre begins to compress, pushed from 3 sides. Men are packed so tightly they can't raise their weapons. The heat is overwhelming. Men fainting from exhaustion and dehydration even before Gothic weapons find them. Dust kicked up by thousands of feet, and hooves creates a choking cloud that turns the battlefield into a hellscape, where friend and foe are barely distinguishable. Commands are lost in the din of clashing metal and screaming men. Emperor Valens, watching his perfect army dissolve, orders his reserves forward. But the Gothic cavalry has circled behind the entire Roman force. The reserves march into a trap, struck from behind before they can deploy. The emperor's bodyguard forms a square around him, elite soldiers determined to die before letting barbarians touch the sacred person of Augustus. But determination means nothing when overwhelmed 10-1. As the afternoon wears on, the battle becomes a massacre. Roman soldiers throw away their shields and run, only to be ridden down by Gothic horsemen. Others try to surrender, but the Goths remember too well their own attempts to surrender 2 years ago. Remember the humiliation and starvation that followed. Quarter is neither asked nor given. The emperor himself disappears in the melee, his body never found, though stories would later claim he died in a farmhouse set ablaze by Gothic warriors. By sunset, 2/3 of the Roman army lies dead on the field. The survivors scatter across the countryside, throwing away their armour, their weapons, anything that might identify them as soldiers. Gothic warriors strip the dead of equipment that will outfit their forces for years to come. More importantly, they have destroyed the myth of Roman invincibility. A barbarian army, using barbarian tactics refined by Roman experience, has annihilated the empire's best legions. The news spreads across the ancient world like wildfire. In Constantinople, panic reigns as citizens expect Gothic horsemen to appear at any moment. In Persia, the Sassanid emperor reconsiders his peace treaties with Rome. In the forests of Germany, tribes that had accepted Roman domination begin to sharpen their swords. But among the Goths, there is no simple celebration. They have won a victory that will echo through history, but they are still strangers in a strange land, still outnumbered by the empire they've wounded but not killed. Fritigern, surveying the field where so many Romans and Goths lie dead, understands what many of his warriors do not. This victory has not ended their problems, but transformed them. They are no longer refugees who can hope for accommodation. They are now conquerors who must forge a new relationship with Rome, not from outside but from within. The Goths have proven they can destroy Roman armies. Now they must prove they can build something from the ruins. The field of Adrianople becomes a symbol, interpreted differently by every generation that follows. For Romans, it marks the beginning of the end, the moment when barbarians proved they could defeat civilization. For the Goths, it represents both their greatest triumph and their point of no return. They have crossed more than the Danube now. They have crossed into legend, into history, into a future where Gothic kingdoms will rise from Roman ashes. Christ and Wulfila, before the swords and politics, before Adrianople changed everything, there was a man with a vision of Gothic souls saved through Gothic words. Wulfila, whose name meant Little Wolf, was born around 311 AD among the Gothic communities north of the Danube, probably descended from Cappadocian Christians carried off in Gothic raids. Raised between two worlds, speaking both Gothic and Greek, understanding both pagan traditions and Christian theology, he would become the architect of Gothic Christianity. Picture him as a young man in Constantinople, where he had come as part of a Gothic delegation. The city overwhelms him with its size, its wealth, its confidence in its own righteousness. In the great church of Hagia Irene, he hears the liturgy sung in Greek, watches the elaborate rituals, sees the gold and incense and hierarchy. But what strikes him most forcefully is the power of the written word. These Romans have captured their God in books, made their prayers permanent, given their faith a form that transcends human memory and mortality. The Gothic language had never been written. It lived in the mouths of speakers, in the memories of skalds, in the songs mothers sang to children. To create a Gothic alphabet, Wulfila had to become a kind of linguistic architect, taking letters from Greek, from Latin, even from Gothic runes, though he carefully avoided those runes too closely associated with pagan magic. Each letter was a small revolution, a transformation of breath into permanence. For over 40 years, Wulfila worked on his translation of the Bible, creating not just a text but a new form of Gothic consciousness. He had to find Gothic words for concepts that had never existed in Gothic thought. How do you translate salvation into a language where the concept doesn't exist? How do you render Holy Spirit in words that won't be confused with the nature spirits of Gothic paganism? Each choice shaped how Goths would understand Christianity for centuries to come. Consider the profound implications of his theological choices. Wulfila was an Arian Christian, believing that Christ was created by God the Father, subordinate though divine. This might seem like an obscure theological point, but for the Goths, it resonated with their understanding of hierarchy, of kings and their sons, of power relationships that maintained order. The Catholic position, that father and son were co-equal, seemed to many Goths like dangerous chaos, a violation of natural order. When Wulfila translated the Bible, he embedded this Arian understanding in the very structure of Gothic Christianity. The Gothic Bible was more than a religious text. It was the first great work of Germanic literature, the prototype for all the biblical translations that would follow in German, English, and Norse. When Gothic priests read from Wulfila's Bible, they were not just conducting religious services, but preserving and transmitting Gothic language and identity. Even as Goths adopted Roman customs, Roman laws, Roman administrative structures, the Gothic Bible reminded them that they were still Goths, that their gods spoke their language. The Gothic Bible, in a small church built from Roman stones in the ruins of a Dacian temple, somewhere in the mountains of what is now Romania, an elderly Gothic priest named Saba holds a book worth more than all the gold in the village. Its pages are purple vellum, the text written in silver ink that catches the candlelight like stars against the evening sky. This is one of the precious copies of Wulfila's Bible, hand-copied over months by scribes who treated each letter as a sacred act. The congregation gathers as daylight fades. Gothic warriors with their swords left at the door, women with children hushed to silence, elderly survivors who remember the pagan days, but have found comfort in this new God who promises justice for the suffering. They cannot read the letters themselves, most of them, but they know this book contains power, that it speaks of a God who favours the humble over the mighty, who promises that the last shall be first. Saba opens to the Gospel of Matthew, his fingers trembling slightly with age and reverence. He begins to read, and the familiar Greek stories become Gothic realities. When Christ speaks of moving mountains with faith, the congregation thinks of the Carpathians that shelter them. When he speaks of wolves in sheep's clothing, they remember the Roman officials who promised food and delivered starvation. The parables of seeds and harvests resonate with people who know the anxiety of planting and the joy of reaping. But tonight, Saba reads of something that strikes deeper than metaphor. Christ's betrayal by one of his own, his trial before hostile authorities, his execution despite innocence. The Gothic congregation listens with growing recognition. They too have been betrayed by those they trusted. They too have stood before hostile judges. They too have suffered despite their innocence. This Roman God, who died on a Roman cross, suddenly seems less Roman, more universal, more Gothic than the old gods, who demanded sacrifice but offered no solidarity with suffering. A young warrior in the back, scarred from Adrianople, listens with particular intensity. He has killed Romans, has felt their blood on his hands, has heard their prayers to this same Christ as they died. How can the same God hear both Roman and Gothic prayers? How can Christ be both the God of the empire and the God of those who fight the empire? These are questions that will haunt Gothic Christianity, that will shape theological debates for generations. After the reading, Saba closes the precious book and speaks in his own words, interpreting, explaining, connecting the ancient stories to present realities. He tells them that their suffering has meaning, that their struggles are witnessed by heaven, that Gothic Christians are part of something larger than tribe or kingdom. He carefully navigates the theological complexities, explaining why their Arian faith is true Christianity, why the Catholics who call them heretics are the real betrayers of Christ's message. The silver letters of the Gothic Bible shimmer in the candlelight, each one a small miracle of preservation and transformation. This book will outlast the kingdoms that the Goths will build. Centuries later, when Gothic is a dead language and the Goths themselves have vanished into other peoples, a single copy of this Bible, the Codex Argenteus, will survive, carrying Wulfila's words into a future he could never have imagined. Warriors of two worlds. The Gothic Federati, who served Rome after Adrianople, lived lives of profound contradiction. By day, they wore Roman armour and followed Roman discipline, standing guard on Roman walls against other barbarians. By night, they returned to Gothic quarters, where Gothic law prevailed, where children learned Gothic songs, where the old gods still received quiet offerings despite official Christianity. They were neither fully Roman nor fully Gothic, but something new, something that would reshape both identities. Marcus, though that wasn't the name his mother gave him, commands a unit of Gothic cavalry in the service of Emperor Theodosius. His men are survivors of Adrianople, warriors who killed Romans 2 years ago and now protect Roman citizens. The irony is not lost on any of them. They take Roman pay, eat Roman rations, follow Roman orders, but when they gather in their barracks, they speak Gothic, share Gothic mead, and dream Gothic dreams. The Roman soldiers they serve alongside view them with a mixture of fear, respect, and contempt. These are the barbarians who destroyed Valens' legions, who proved that Rome could bleed. Yet here they are, following orders, maintaining discipline, often more reliable than Roman troops who have grown soft on garrison duty. The Gothic Federati No, they must be better than Roman soldiers, just to be considered equal. Any failure, any sign of barbarism, confirms Roman prejudices. Any success is attributed to Roman training rather than Gothic capability. The children of these federati grow up in a strange borderland. They learn Latin in Roman schools during the day, Gothic from their grandmothers at night. They play with Roman children but are never allowed to forget they are different. Some embrace Roman culture entirely, changing their names, abandoning Gothic customs, trying to disappear into the empire. Others cling fiercely to Gothic identity, viewing any adoption of Roman ways as betrayal. Most live between, code switching constantly, Gothic at home, Roman in public, something entirely new when among other Federate children who share their peculiar predicament. Alaric's dream. In the year 395 AD, a young Gothic nobleman named Alaric stood at a crossroads that would determine the fate of the Western world. Born after the crossing of the Danube, raised in the shadow of Adrianople, educated in both Gothic tradition and Roman administration, he embodied all the contradictions of his people's position. He had served Rome faithfully, leading Gothic federati in the service of Emperor Theodosius, fighting other barbarians to preserve Roman order. But Theodosius was dead, and his weak sons had divided the empire between them, creating opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. Alaric's dream was not simple conquest. He envisioned something far more complex, a Gothic kingdom within the Roman Empire, recognized, legitimate, permanent. Not the desperate wagon fort of refugees, but a true territorial power, with its own laws, its own nobility, its own destiny. He would use Roman ambitions against Rome itself, playing east against west, promising service while demanding concessions, transforming Gothic military power into political authority. The path to this dream led through blood and betrayal, negotiation and devastation. For 15 years, Alaric marched his people, now calling themselves Visigoths, the noble Goths, across the empire. They ravaged Greece, forcing the Eastern Emperor to grant Alaric the title of Magister Militum, commander of Roman armies. They invaded Italy, besieging Milan and Ravenna, forcing the Western Emperor to negotiate. Each campaign was carefully calculated, enough violence to compel negotiation, not so much as to unite all Romans against him. Picture Alaric's army, perhaps 40,000 souls, moving like a mobile nation across the ancient roads of empire. These are not just warriors but entire families, 3 generations travelling together. Wagons carry everything from blacksmith forges to Christian altars, from Gothic law codes to Roman administrative documents. Children are born on the march, elders die, and are buried in foreign soil. This is not an army, but a people searching for home, led by a king who dreams of transformation. The Roman senator Stilicho, himself half Vandal, understood what Alaric represented better than most Romans. He saw in the Gothic king not just another barbarian warlord, but a potential partner in preserving what could be preserved of Roman order. Their negotiations were masterpieces of complex diplomacy, each man representing multiple interests, neither fully trusted by those they claimed to serve. When Stilicho was executed by paranoid Roman courtiers in 408 AD, Alaric lost not just an adversary, but perhaps the only Roman who truly understood his vision. Without Stilicho's pragmatic influence, the Western Roman court retreated into delusion and arrogance. They refused Alaric's increasingly reasonable demands for land and recognition. They massacred the families of Gothic federati, serving in Roman armies, driving 30,000 warriors to join Alaric's forces. They seemed to believe that the empire of Augustus and Trajan still existed, that barbarians could be dismissed with imperial contempt. They were about to learn otherwise. In 410 AD, Alaric stood before the gates of Rome itself, the eternal city, unconquered for 800 years, the heart of the ancient world, lay at his mercy. He had besieged it twice before, each time withdrawing when terms were offered. But this third time, Roman intransigence had exhausted his patience. The dream of peaceful integration had failed. If Rome would not grant the Goths a place within the empire, they would take it. The Eternal City falls, August 24th, 410 AD. The night is hot and still, the kind of Roman summer night when the air itself seems to press down like a weight. In the Gothic camp outside the Salarian Gate, warriors sharpen their weapons one last time, check their armour, make their peace with Christ or older gods. They know tomorrow they will do what Hannibal couldn't, what generations of enemies had failed to achieve. Tomorrow, they will enter Rome. Inside the city, most Romans sleep uneasily, still believing their walls impregnable, their city divinely protected. They don't know that Gothic slaves within the city have been preparing for this night, that the Salarian Gate has been compromised, that by dawn their world will have ended. Some wealthy Romans clutch letters of safe passage they've purchased from Gothic commanders, believing gold can buy safety from history. They're about to learn that some moments cannot be bought or sold, only endured. The gate opens from within at the appointed hour. Gothic warriors pour through like water through a broken dam, their entry so swift and silent that entire neighbourhoods fall before alarms can be raised. These are not the wild barbarians of Roman nightmare, but disciplined soldiers following strict orders. Alaric has commanded that churches be spared, that those who seek sanctuary in sacred spaces be protected. He wants to be remembered not as a destroyer, but as a conqueror who showed restraint, a Christian king who respected Christian sites even while humbling the ancient capital of paganism. By dawn, Gothic warriors stand in the Forum Romanum, the heart of the ancient world. The marble statues of emperors and gods look down on men their creators would have considered barely human. The Senate House, where Cicero thundered against tyranny, where Caesar was offered a crown, now echoes with Gothic voices. The sacred fire of Vesta, tended for 1,000 years, flickers and dies as its virgin guardians flee. An epoch ends not with apocalyptic destruction, but with exhausted surrender. Yet this is not the total devastation that Roman propaganda would later describe. Gothic warriors loot, certainly carrying off treasures accumulated over centuries of conquest, but they're selective, taking portable wealth while leaving structures largely intact. Some Romans are killed, others enslaved, but many more are simply relieved of their gold and left to contemplate their new reality. Churches remain untouched, their congregations huddled inside, listening to the sounds of empire falling outside their walls. A Gothic warrior breaks into a Roman palace, sword drawn, expecting resistance. Instead, he finds an elderly Roman matron sitting calmly in her atrium, surrounded by the busts of her ancestors. She offers him wine from a golden cup, addresses him in perfect Gothic, tells him she's been expecting this day since Adrianople. She shows him where the family gold is hidden, asks only that he spare the servants who have nowhere else to go. The warrior, perhaps reminded of his own grandmother, takes the gold but leaves the house otherwise untouched. Such scenes, multiplied across the city, create the strange texture of this strangest of conquests. Saint Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, captures the shock that reverberates across the Mediterranean world. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. In Constantinople, Emperor Arcadius receives the news with disbelief, then relief that it's his rival brother's problem. In Carthage, Bishop Augustine begins writing The City of God, arguing that the fall of earthly Rome only emphasizes the importance of the heavenly Jerusalem. Across the empire, Christians and pagans alike struggle to understand how God or the gods could permit such a reversal. After 3 days, Alaric orders his forces to withdraw. They leave Rome humiliated but not destroyed, violated but not murdered. The Gothic king has made his point. The empire that refused to grant his people dignity as allies must accept them as conquerors. But even this supreme victory feels hollow. Alaric wanted to be a Roman general, a legitimate player in imperial politics. Instead, he's become the barbarian who sacked Rome, a role that history will never let him escape. Theodoric's crown. 70 years after Alaric's bitter triumph, another Gothic king stood in another Roman city with another vision of what Gothic rule could mean. Theodoric, whom history would call the Great, entered Ravenna in 493 AD, not as a conqueror, but as a theoretically legitimate ruler, authorized by the Eastern Emperor to govern Italy in the name of Rome. He had defeated and killed Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain who had deposed the last Western emperor, and now claimed Italy as the homeland of the Ostrogothic people. Where Alaric had been a wanderer, Theodoric would be a builder. Where Alaric had sought recognition within the Roman system, Theodoric would create his own synthesis of Gothic and Roman civilization. His kingdom would last only 60 years, but in that brief moment, it would show what might have been possible if the ancient world had found a way to transform rather than collapse. Theodoric had spent his youth as a hostage in Constantinople, receiving the finest Roman education while never forgetting he was Gothic royalty. He could quote Plato in Greek, discuss theology in Latin, and deliver justice in Gothic. He understood Roman administration, Roman law, Roman culture, but also Gothic pride, Gothic tradition, Gothic independence. When he established his capital in Ravenna, he created a court that was simultaneously the last echo of Western Rome and the first expression of medieval Europe. Picture his palace complex, where Roman mosaics depicting Gothic kings adorned walls built by Roman architects following Gothic instructions. In the throne room, Roman senators in traditional togas stood beside Gothic warriors in furs and gold, both serving a king who wore Roman purple over Gothic armour. The official documents were written in Latin, but the military commands were given in Gothic. Roman law applied to Romans, Gothic law to Goths, and Theodoric himself served as the bridge between systems, the translator of cultures. The king's daily routine embodied this cultural fusion. Mornings were devoted to Roman-style administrative duties, reviewing tax records, appointing officials, corresponding with the emperor in Constantinople, and other rulers around the Mediterranean. Afternoons might be spent in Gothic fashion, hunting in the pine forests outside Ravenna, training with weapons, maintaining the martial skills that legitimized Gothic rule. Evenings brought elaborate banquets where Roman delicacies were served alongside Gothic mead, where classical poets recited beside Gothic skalds. Under Theodoric's rule, Italy experienced something it hadn't known for generations: peace and prosperity. The aqueducts were repaired, bringing fresh water to cities that had learned to live without it. The roads were maintained, allowing trade to flow from the Alps to Sicily. The harvests were protected from raiders, the markets from corrupt officials. Romans who had feared Gothic barbarism found themselves living more securely than they had under the last emperors. Goths who had expected to rule by the sword found themselves becoming administrators, judges, patrons of art. Theodoric's relationship with the Roman Senate was particularly complex. These men, heirs to 1,000 years of dignity, had to acknowledge a Gothic king as their master. Yet Theodoric treated them with elaborate respect, consulting them on civil matters, appointing them to high offices, maintaining the fiction that the ancient institutions still mattered. He needed their expertise to run the complex machinery of Italian government, but more importantly, he needed their acceptance to legitimize his rule in Roman eyes. The religious situation added another layer of complexity. Theodoric and his Goths were Arian Christians, while the Roman population was increasingly Catholic. Rather than impose Arian Christianity, Theodoric proclaimed religious tolerance, protecting both churches, even protecting Jews and pagans. This wasn't modern pluralism, but pragmatic governance, recognition that forced conversion would create more problems than theological unity would solve. Gothic Arian churches rose next to Roman Catholic basilicas, their separate congregations passing each other on feast days, maintaining uneasy coexistence between empires. You are Marcus Aurelius Cassiodorus, though your friends call you senator, and you serve at the pleasure of a Gothic king in the Roman consulship of 512 AD. Your morning begins as your ancestors' mornings began, with the salutation of clients in your atrium, but now, among the traditional Roman families, seeking your patronage are Gothic nobles who need your expertise in navigating Roman law. You conduct business in Latin with Romans, in Gothic with Goths, sometimes switching languages mid-sentence when discussing matters that concern both peoples. Your official position is quaestor, the king's chief legal advisor and correspondence secretary. Every letter that goes out in Theodoric's name passes through your hands, every word carefully chosen to maintain the delicate balance between Gothic strength and Roman dignity. When you write to the emperor in Constantinople, you must acknowledge his theoretical supremacy while asserting Theodoric's practical independence. When you address the Gothic nobles, you must respect their military pride while encouraging them to embrace civil governance. Today's first task is adjudicating a dispute between a Roman landowner and Gothic settlers. The Goths were awarded 1/3 of the estate's revenues as part of the original settlement, but the Roman claims they're taking more, while the Goths argue the Roman is hiding income. You must apply both Roman property law and Gothic customary rights, finding a solution that both sides can accept as just. The wrong decision could spark violence that might spread throughout the province. After the morning's hearings, you walk through Ravenna's streets to the palace complex. The city is a marvel of contrasts. Roman merchants hawk their wares in the forum, while Gothic warriors patrol the walls. In the workshop quarter, Roman artisans craft elaborate golden jewellery in Germanic styles for Gothic nobles who pay with Byzantine gold coins. Children play in the streets, some clearly Roman, some Gothic, others increasingly hard to categorize as intermarriage slowly blurs the lines. The palace scriptorium is your sanctuary, where a dozen scribes copy your letters and documents. Here you're composing your great work, the Variae, a collection of official correspondence that you hope will preserve both the practical knowledge of Roman administration and the unique experiment of Gothic Roman. Cooperation. You include everything from formulaic appointments to philosophical discussions on the nature of government, from building specifications for aqueducts to theological arguments about the Trinity. Future generations, you hope, will understand through these documents how civilization persisted even as the world transformed. Your afternoon is spent in the King's Council, where Gothic military commanders sit alongside Roman administrators. The discussion today concerns the northern frontier, where other Germanic tribes probe for weakness. The Gothic generals want to launch preemptive raids, arguing that strength projected prevents greater conflicts. The Roman officials worry about the cost, the disruption to trade, the message it sends to Constantinople. Theodoric listens to both sides, his face revealing nothing, before issuing commands that somehow satisfy both factions. In the evening, you attend a banquet at the palace. The dining hall is a masterpiece of cultural fusion. Roman style, reclining couches are arranged around low tables, but the Goths sit upright on chairs, uncomfortable with the prone position that suggests vulnerability. The meal begins with Roman delicacies, oysters from the Adriatic, wine from Campania, but progresses to Germanic favourites, roasted boar, strong mead, dense bread that Roman stomachs struggle to digest. Conversation flows between Latin, Gothic, and Greek, with translators discreetly whispering to those who can't follow. You find yourself seated between a young Gothic noble who wants to learn Latin poetry and an elderly Roman senator who still dreams of restoration. The Goth asks you to explain Virgil's Aeneid, fascinated by the story of refugees from Troy founding Rome, seeing parallels to Gothic wanderings. The Roman mutters about barbarians corrupting classical texts, but you notice him listening intently as you explain how the Goths, like Aeneas, are perhaps destined to preserve what they seem to destroy. As the evening wears on and wine loosens tongues, the conversation turns philosophical. What is Rome, really? Is it a city, an empire, an idea? Can Goths become Roman while remaining Gothic? Can Romans maintain their identity under Gothic rule? There are no easy answers, but in the questioning itself, in the fact that Goths and Romans can debate such matters peacefully, you see hope for a synthesis that might birth something entirely new. The gardens of Ravenna. Evening falls like silk across the gardens of Theodoric's palace, where fountains speak in liquid whispers, and marble pathways wind between roses bred by Roman gardeners for Gothic queens. The air carries the salt tang of the nearby Adriatic, mixed with the perfume of jasmine that blooms only at night. Peacocks, descendants of birds brought from India in the days of the emperors, trail their jewelled feathers across lawns that Gothic children play upon, their laughter mixing with the ancient birds' cries. In the centre of the garden stands a pavilion where Roman architectural principles support a roof decorated with Gothic geometric patterns, where classical columns carved with acanthus leaves hold up beams painted with the swirling designs of the northern forests. Here, philosophers debate in Greek, while Gothic guards stand watch, understanding nothing of the words but everything about the necessity of protecting spaces where ideas can flourish. The trees themselves tell the story of empire and migration. Ancient olives planted by Romans shade Gothic benches. Apple trees from the northern forests grow beside Mediterranean figs. Each plant carries memory, the olives of classical civilization, the apples of Gothic homeland, growing together in soil that belongs fully to neither, but feeds both equally. At night, when the wind moves through their leaves, they seem to whisper in languages both dead and living, telling stories that only the garden remembers. Water moves through the garden in channels designed by Roman engineers, but decorated with Gothic metalwork, bronze dragons and wolves, whose eyes catch the last light of day. The water comes from aqueducts that Theodoric has restored, Roman infrastructure maintained by Gothic rule, carrying life from distant mountains to this created paradise. In the pools, fish from the Danube swim beside species from the Tiber, their different colours and patterns creating new beauty and unexpected combination. This garden is not just a place of beauty, but a statement of philosophy. Theodoric's vision made manifest in living form. Here, the Gothic love of nature meets Roman architectural ambition. Here, northern strength and southern sophistication intertwine like climbing vines. Here, in this brief moment of balance, in this small space of curated perfection, the transformation of the ancient world pauses, takes breath, and for just these few decades, finds peace. Toledo's Gothic throne. While Theodoric built his synthesis in Italy, his Visigothic cousins were creating their own kingdom in lands that would one day be Spain. The year 507 AD marked a crucial transformation when the Visigoths, driven from most of Gaul by the Franks, established Toledo as their permanent capital. This ancient city, perched on granite cliffs above the Tagus River, would become the heart of a Gothic kingdom that would endure for 2 centuries, outlasting every other barbarian state carved from Roman territory. The Visigothic path to Spain had been even more tortuous than the Ostrogothic journey to Italy. After Alaric's death, they had wandered under his brother Athelf, seeking the homeland their great king had never found. They had served Rome as federati, fighting Vandals and Suevian Alans in Spain in return for lands in Aquitaine. They had built a kingdom centred on Toulouse, only to lose most of it to Frankish aggression. Now compressed into Iberia, they would create something unprecedented, a unified Gothic state that merged Roman administration, Gothic military tradition, and eventually Catholic Christianity into a distinctive civilization. King Leovigild, ruling from 568 to 586 AD, transformed the Visigothic monarchy from a warrior chieftainship into a sophisticated state. He established ceremonial that rivaled Constantinople, wearing the crown and purple that marked legitimate sovereignty. He minted gold coins that proclaimed Gothic power, while maintaining Roman monetary standards. Most crucially, he began the process of territorial unification, conquering the Suevi kingdom in Galicia, subduing Cantabrian mountaineers, pushing Byzantine forces from their Spanish footholds. Toledo itself embodied Visigothic ambitions. The old Roman walls were rebuilt with Gothic improvements, creating fortifications that would resist siege for centuries. The palace complex on the highest point of the city combined Roman basilica design with Germanic great halls, spaces where Roman-style administration happened alongside Gothic assembly democracy. Churches rose throughout the city, Arian and Catholic standing sometimes literally side by side, their competing liturgies creating a sacred geography of theological division that would only be resolved through political revolution. The Visigothic nobility maintained a complex relationship with the Hispano-Roman population, who vastly outnumbered their Gothic rulers. Unlike in Italy, where Theodoric maintained separation, in Spain the boundaries gradually dissolved. The prohibition on intermarriage was lifted. Gothic nobles adopted Roman names alongside their Germanic ones. Roman aristocrats learned Gothic to advance at court. By 600 AD, it was increasingly difficult to determine who was Goth and who was Roman, based on anything other than legal status. And even that was becoming meaningless. The laws of Euric. In the royal scriptorium of Toledo, teams of legal scholars labour over the impossible task of creating a single law code for two peoples with entirely different legal traditions. King Euric, even before the move to Toledo, had recognised that Gothic customary law, preserved in memory and precedent, could not effectively govern a complex territorial state. Roman law, vast and sophisticated, but designed for a unified empire, couldn't simply be adopted wholesale for a Gothic kingdom. Something new was needed. The Code of Euric, and its successors, represented the first systematic attempt to create written Germanic law. Unlike Roman law, with its abstract principles and universal applications, Gothic law remained fundamentally personal and contextual. A crime's punishment depended not just on what was done, but who did it and to whom. A Gothic warrior who killed a Roman paid a different compensation than a Roman who killed a Goth. A woman's legal status depended on whether she was Gothic or Roman, married or unmarried, under her father's protection or independent. Consider the complexity facing a judge in Visigothic Spain. Before him stands a man accused of theft. First, he must determine, is the accused Goth or Roman? Is the victim Goth or Roman? Were there witnesses? And what is their ethnic status? Was the theft from a church, which brings ecclesiastical law into play? Was it from the king's property, invoking special royal protections? Each answer leads to different procedures, different penalties, different possibilities for resolution. The Visigothic laws reveal a society struggling with fundamental questions about justice and identity. The principle of wergild, compensation paid to a victim's family instead of physical punishment, conflicted with Roman ideas of state-administered justice. Gothic traditions of trial by ordeal, where guilt was determined by survival of physical tests, seemed barbarous to Roman legal minds trained in rhetoric and evidence. Yet both systems had to function within the same kingdom, often in the same courtroom. The law codes also show us intimate details of daily life in Gothic Spain. Regulations about marriage reveal anxieties about maintaining Gothic identity while acknowledging Roman numerical dominance. Rules about property show a society where Roman-style latifundia coexisted with Gothic communal holdings. Punishments for religious crimes expose the ongoing tension between Arian and Catholic Christianity, between pagan survivals and Christian orthodoxy. Every law is a window into conflicts that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Golden treasures. In the workshop of Theodoric the goldsmith, the morning light illuminates a workbench where the artistic traditions of half the ancient world converge. He is crafting an eagle fibula, the distinctively Gothic brooch that proclaims its wearer's heritage. But his techniques combine Germanic traditions, learned from his grandfather, with Byzantine methods taught by a Greek master and Hispano-Roman designs, sketched by his Iberian apprentice. The eagle takes shape slowly under his skilled hands. The body is formed from gold, beaten so thin it seems to capture light within its substance. The eyes will be garnets from India, traded through Constantinople, cut and polished to catch fire in candlelight. The wings are articulated, each feather a separate piece that moves independently, creating the illusion of flight when the wearer walks. This is not just jewelry but philosophy made tangible. The Gothic eagle that once symbolized Odin, now carrying a tiny Christian cross in its talons, soaring between heaven and earth, between pagan past and Christian present. Around the eagle's neck, Theodoric inscribes microscopic runes that only he can read, a prayer for protection that combines Germanic formulas with Christian invocations. His Gothic customers want traditional symbols even as they profess new faith. His Roman customers want Gothic style as a sign of political allegiance. His Byzantine customers want something exotic to display in Constantinople's markets. Each piece he creates must speak multiple languages to multiple audiences. The techniques themselves are a synthesis of cultures. The cloisonné work, where garnets are set in gold cells, came from the steppes with Gothic contact with Sarmatian and Hunnic peoples. The filigree, twisted gold wire creating delicate patterns, shows Byzantine influence. The chip carving patterns that decorate the reverse reveal Germanic traditions, stretching back to the forests of the north. Yet combined, they create something uniquely Visigothic, an artistic language that belongs to this time and place alone. In his workshop hang examples of his finest work, pieces that will one day be discovered in tombs and treasures across Spain. A chalice that combines the Roman shape with Gothic animal interlace, created for a Catholic bishop who needs to show respect for Gothic rule. A sword belt, decorated with biblical scenes rendered in Germanic artistic style, made for a Gothic noble who wants to display his Christianity without abandoning warrior traditions. A crown that no Roman emperor would recognize, but which speaks perfectly to Visigothic concepts of royal power. Scholars and saints. In the monastery of San Milan, high in the Riojan mountains, Braulio of Zaragoza carefully copies a manuscript that represents the intellectual fusion of the Visigothic kingdom. The text is Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, an encyclopedia that attempts to preserve all human knowledge, Roman learning filtered through Gothic practicality and Christian theology. Each page requires days of labour, each initial letter a small artwork, each word a prayer for the preservation of civilization. Isidore himself, bishop and scholar, embodied the transformation of Gothic Spain, born into a Hispano-Roman family that had completely accepted Gothic rule. Educated in both classical and Christian traditions, he became the intellectual architect of a new synthesis. His writings preserved Roman knowledge that would otherwise have been lost, but transformed it for a world where Gothic kings ruled and Christian truth superseded pagan philosophy. The etymologies contained everything from grammar to geography, from medicine to mineralogy, from architecture to agriculture, but this wasn't mere compilation. Isidore reinterpreted classical knowledge through Christian lenses, explained Roman concepts in terms Gothic rulers could understand, created bridges between worlds that seemed incompatible. When he wrote about languages, he included Gothic alongside Latin and Greek as a legitimate tongue of learning. When he discussed law, he synthesized Roman jurisprudence with Gothic custom. When he explored theology, he found ways to explain Catholic doctrine that Arian Goths could accept. In monasteries across Visigothic Spain, similar work continued. Monks copied not just biblical texts, but classical authors, preserving Virgil and Cicero for future generations. They translated Greek works into Latin, making Eastern Christian thought accessible to Western minds. They created new liturgies that combined Roman ceremonial with Gothic musical traditions. They were, without knowing it, creating the intellectual foundation for medieval Europe, preserving the DNA of classical civilization within the protective shell of Gothic power and Christian faith. The schools attached to these monasteries educated both Gothic and Roman children, creating a new generation that was neither purely one nor the other. These children learned Latin and Gothic, studied Roman history and Gothic genealogies, read both Aristotle and the Bible. They would become the administrators and bishops, the judges and generals of a kingdom that was inventing itself day by day, word by word, manuscript by manuscript. The mausoleum's secret. You stand before Theodoric's tomb in the fading light of an autumn afternoon in 540 AD, 20 years after the great king's death. The mausoleum rises before you like a crown of stone, utterly unlike any building in Italy, neither Roman nor Gothic, but something entirely itself. The massive dome, carved from a single block of Istrian limestone, weighing 300 tons, defies comprehension. How did they move it? How did they raise it? The Gothic workers who built this monument took their secrets with them. You climb the worn steps, your fingers tracing the weathered stone where thousands of hands have touched before yours. The lower level, built in the Roman style with precise ashlar blocks, speaks of order and permanence. But as you ascend, the decoration becomes something else. Geometric patterns that echo the metalwork of Gothic brooches, the same interlacing designs that once decorated the shields of warriors who crossed the Danube a lifetime ago. Inside the upper chamber, silence embraces you like a living thing. The porphyry sarcophagus sits empty. Theodoric's body removed decades ago when the Byzantines reconquered Ravenna, scattered by those who feared even his dead presence. But something remains here, something that transcends physical remains. The afternoon sun, filtering through the small windows, creates patterns of light and shadow that seem to move, to breathe, to remember. You think of all this man represented, this Gothic king who ruled Romans more justly than their own emperors, this barbarian who preserved civilization when civilized men were destroying it. In this tomb, the entire Gothic experiment is crystallized, the attempt to be both conqueror and continuator, to maintain distinct identity while governing an alien culture, to transform without being transformed. The empty sarcophagus seems to ask whether such synthesis was ever truly possible, whether the Goths were always doomed to be absorbed or expelled, never simply accepted. The dome above you, that impossible weight of stone, bears a crack running from edge to center, created, legend says, the moment Theodoric died. You wonder if it's true, if stone itself can mourn, if the physical world registered the passing of something unprecedented. Through the crack, a thin line of sky is visible, neither fully inside nor outside, neither completely enclosed nor entirely open. It seems the perfect metaphor for Gothic existence in the Roman world. As you prepare to leave, you notice inscriptions carved into the walls by centuries of visitors, Gothic runes mixed with Latin letters, Greek prayers, neighbour Germanic symbols. Even in death, even in absence, Theodoric's tomb remains a place where worlds meet, where identities blur, where the rigid categories of Roman and barbarian dissolve into something more complex. You add your own mark, whatever that might be, to this palimpsest of memory, becoming part of the story that continues long after its protagonists have vanished. When Byzantium returned, the year 535 AD, brought to Italy the most brilliant general of the age, Belisarius, servant of Emperor Justinian, who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its ancient glory. The Ostrogothic kingdom, weakened by succession disputes after Theodoric's death, seemed ripe for reconquest. What followed was not the swift victory Justinian expected, but 20 years of warfare that would destroy the very Italy he sought to reclaim. Belisarius landed in Sicily with only 7,500 men, a force that would have been laughable except for two factors. The Gothic kingdom was tearing itself apart in civil war, and Belisarius was perhaps the finest tactical commander since Caesar. He took Sicily almost without fighting, the population welcoming him as a liberator from Gothic Arian rule. Naples fell after a brief siege, Belisarius's men entering through an abandoned aqueduct. By 536 AD, he entered Rome itself, the eternal city welcoming Byzantine troops, while its Gothic garrison fled north. But the Goths found new leadership in Vitiges, a soldier from the ranks who understood that Gothic survival required total war. He gathered every Gothic warrior in Italy, perhaps 100,000 men, and besieged Rome. For a year and 9 days, the city endured horrors that surpassed even Alaric's sack. The aqueducts were cut, leaving Romans to drink from the polluted Tiber. Food ran out, citizens eating rats, then leather, then rumours whispered of worse. The population that had welcomed liberation now cursed Byzantine and Goth alike. Belisarius held Rome through tactical genius and ruthless determination. He turned the city's statuary into projectiles for catapults, launched night raids that kept the Gothic army off balance, recruited defenders from Rome's desperate population. When Gothic reinforcements arrived from Gaul, when it seemed the city must fall, Byzantine reinforcements materialized, landed by a fleet that still controlled the seas. The Gothic siege collapsed, Vitiges retreating to Ravenna, the kingdom's situation desperate but not yet hopeless. What followed was a war of attrition that consumed Italy like a slow-burning fire. Cities changed hands repeatedly, each conquest leaving them more ruined than before. The countryside was devastated, farms burned, livestock slaughtered, populations scattered or enslaved. The sophisticated agricultural system that had fed the Mediterranean world for centuries collapsed. Aqueducts that Theodoric had carefully maintained were deliberately destroyed to deny water to enemies. Italy was committing suicide, its Roman population dying alongside their Gothic rulers. The Gothic resistance produced moments of extraordinary heroism and horrible tragedy. At the siege of Auxinmum, Gothic women threw themselves and their children from the walls rather than surrender. At the Battle of Tagenae, the Gothic king Totila led a cavalry charge that nearly broke Byzantine lines, dying with a lance through his chest, while still calling his men forward. At Mons Lactarius, the last Gothic army made its final stand. 6,000 warriors dying rather than surrendering, their king Teia fighting on foot among his men until overwhelmed. Procopius, the Byzantine historian who witnessed these wars, wrote with increasing horror about what victory was costing. He described cities that had been jewels of civilization, reduced to rubble, inhabited only by ghosts and wild animals. He recorded population declines of 90% in some regions, entire provinces returning to wilderness. He questioned whether reconquering Italy was worth destroying it, whether the empire was restoring civilization or extinguishing it. The Byzantine victory, when it finally came in 553 AD, was utterly Pyrrhic. Italy was conquered but ruined, nominally returned to the empire, but too devastated to defend or administer. Within 15 years, new Germanic invaders, the Lombards, would arrive to find not the rich kingdom the Goths had conquered, but a broken land that would take centuries to recover. The Ostrogothic people simply ceased to exist, killed in battle, scattered in slavery, or absorbed into other populations. Their kingdom, which had shown the possibility of synthesis between Germanic and Roman culture, vanished as if it had never been. The Gothic Wars marked more than the end of Ostrogothic power. They marked the true end of ancient Italy. the final severance of continuity with the classical world. The senatorial aristocracy, which had survived Alaric and thrived under Theodoric, was extinguished. The cities that had defined Roman civilization for a millennium were depopulated. The infrastructure that had made Rome an empire, roads, aqueducts, ports, administrative systems, collapsed beyond repair. In trying to restore the past, Justinian had destroyed its last remnants, the Council of Toledo. In 589 AD, as Italy bled from Byzantine reconquest, Visigothic Spain experienced transformation through theology rather than warfare. In the Basilica of Toledo, King Rechad stood before assembled bishops and nobles to announce his conversion from Arian to Catholic Christianity. With this declaration, the last major division between Gothic rulers and Roman subjects dissolved, creating for the first time a truly unified Visigothic state. The path to this moment had been prepared by political necessity and personal conviction. Rechad's father, Leo Vigild, had tried to unify Spain through force, compelling Catholics to accept Arianism. His son chose the opposite path, recognizing that the Goths, perhaps 100,000 in a population of several million, could only rule through consent. By accepting the faith of their subjects, the Gothic elite removed the last barrier to complete integration. But this was more than political calculation. Rechad seems to have genuinely believed that Catholic Christianity better expressed divine truth, that the theological position his people had held for 2 centuries was error. The Third Council of Toledo, which formalized this conversion, was extraordinary in its scope and implications. Gothic nobles publicly renounced beliefs their families had held since Wulfila's time. Arian bishops, rather than being persecuted, were offered positions in the Catholic hierarchy if they accepted Orthodox doctrine. Arian churches were reconsecrated rather than destroyed. The entire religious transformation was managed with a moderation that avoided the bloodshed that had accompanied religious changes elsewhere. Picture the scene in Toledo's basilica as the council proceeded. Gothic warriors, in their distinctive clothing, standing beside Roman aristocrats in senatorial dress. Bishops reading theological declarations in Latin that were translated into Gothic for those who needed it. The king himself, dressed in purple and gold, prostrating himself before the altar in a gesture that combined Germanic submission to divine power with Roman ceremonial tradition. The smoking incense, the chanted prayers, the golden crosses catching candlelight, all creating an atmosphere where transformation seemed not just possible but inevitable. The council's decrees went beyond religious conversion. They established a new relationship between church and state that would define medieval European governance. The king was recognized as protector of the faith, but also as subject to ecclesiastical guidance. Royal succession, previously determined by Gothic election and warrior acclaim, now required ecclesiastical confirmation. The bishops gained the right to supervise local administration, creating a parallel governance structure that checked royal power. This was the birth of what would later be called the Two Swords Doctrine, spiritual and temporal authority working in theoretical harmony. The transformation of Gothic identity following Toledo was profound. Within a generation, the distinction between Goth and Roman became largely meaningless. Intermarriage, already common, accelerated. Gothic nobles adopted Roman names exclusively. The Gothic language, already declining, disappeared from official use. By 650 AD, the term Goth had become a legal classification rather than an ethnic identity, and even that distinction was fading. The Visigoths had conquered Spain only to be conquered by it in turn. Yet something unique emerged from this synthesis. Visigothic Spain developed its own artistic style, combining Germanic animal motifs with Byzantine grandeur and local Iberian traditions. The Visigothic script, evolved from Roman cursive but distinctly different, would be used in Spanish monasteries for centuries. Visigothic law, constantly refined and expanded, created one of the most sophisticated legal systems of the early medieval world. This wasn't simply Romanization, but the creation of something new, something that was neither purely Gothic nor purely Roman but distinctly Spanish. Songs of the Wanderers. In the Great Hall of Count Bulgar of Septimania, the last evening of winter in 680 AD, brings the traditional gathering for the recitation of old stories. The Count himself is legally a Visigoth, though his blood is mixed with Roman, Gaulish, and who knows what else. His hall stands in what was once Roman Gaul, on land that has been Gothic for 2 centuries, in a county that pays nominal allegiance to Toledo, but operates with near-complete independence. Here, on the margins of the Gothic world, the old traditions survive longest. The bard who rises to speak is ancient, his memory stretching back to grandparents who remembered Theodoric's time. He doesn't read from any book, for these stories live in memory alone, passed from voice to voice across generations. Tonight he will tell of Alaric, the great king of the Eastern Goths, who ruled when Rome still feared Gothic power. But this is not the historical Alaric that Byzantine chroniclers recorded. This is Germanic of the stories, transformed by centuries of retelling into something between history and myth. The tale begins with a king in his glory, ruling from the Danube to the distant northern seas. His hall is filled with heroes whose names ring like swords: Hlothver and Hama, Biki and Sifeka. The bard's voice rises and falls in the ancient rhythms, alliterative verses that help memory and create atmosphere. The listeners know this story, have heard it many times, but that's part of its power. They wait for favourite passages, mouth along with famous speeches, feel the satisfaction of patterns completed. But tonight the bard adds something new, verses he learned from a trader who heard them in the Frankish lands, where Gothic stories have mixed with other Germanic traditions. In these new verses, Germanic becomes connected to other legendary cycles, his heroes appearing in tales of Attila the Hun, of Theodoric transformed into Theodric of Bern, of the Nibelungs and their cursed gold. The Gothic stories are escaping their ethnic boundaries, becoming part of a broader Germanic legendary tradition that will eventually flow into the high medieval epics. The young people in the hall, those born since the conversion to Catholicism, listen with complicated feelings. These are their ancestral stories, but they also seem foreign, speaking of values and gods that the church condemns, the wandering heroes of the tales, winning glory through violence and dying in hopeless last stands, seem both admirable and troubling. The gold they seek is both treasure and curse. The loyalty they show to lords who lead them to doom is both noble and foolish. The stories preserve something essential about Gothic identity, but an identity that no longer quite fits the world they inhabit. As the evening deepens and wine flows, other voices join in, adding their own fragments of memory. An old woman sings a lullaby her grandmother taught her, Gothic words whose meaning is already becoming obscure. A warrior shares verses about Alaric that were composed by his war band, verses that never entered the official histories. A merchant tells of meeting a man in Constantinople who claimed descent from Theodoric, though the last of that line supposedly died decades ago. The Crescent, over Toledo. The year 711 AD began like so many others in the Visigothic kingdom, with political intrigue and civil conflict. King Witiza had died, and the succession was disputed between his sons and Duke Roderick, who had seized the throne with the support of part of the nobility. It was a familiar pattern in Gothic politics, rival factions seeking external support for their claims. But this time, the external support would prove fatal. Supporters of Witiza's sons invited assistance from the Muslim governor of North Africa. By year's end, the Visigothic kingdom would cease to exist. The Muslim force that crossed from Africa to Gibraltar in April was small, perhaps 7,000 Arabs and Berbers, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad. In ordinary circumstances, The Gothic army could have easily repelled such an invasion, but these were not ordinary circumstances. The kingdom was exhausted from civil war, divided between factions that hated each other more than any foreign enemy. When Roderick marched south with his army, he brought with him nobles whose loyalty was questionable at best. The Battle of Guadalete, in July 711 AD, was less a battle than a collapse. As the armies engaged, the wings of Roderick's force, commanded by nobles loyal to Witiza's sons, simply withdrew or switched sides. The Gothic centre, where Roderick fought with his personal guard, was surrounded and overwhelmed. The king disappeared in the fighting, his body never found, though legends would claim he escaped to live as a hermit in penance for losing the kingdom. In a single afternoon, 300 years of Gothic rule ended. What followed was not the systematic resistance that might have been expected, but rather rapid, almost eager submission. City after city opened its gates to Muslim forces, often negotiating favourable terms rather than fighting. The Gothic nobility, when not fleeing to the northern mountains, frequently converted to Islam to maintain their positions and properties. The Catholic bishops, who had been pillars of Visigothic rule, negotiated agreements that allowed Christians to practice their faith in exchange for accepting Muslim sovereignty. Within 3 years, Muslims controlled all but the remotest northern regions of the peninsula. Why did the Visigothic kingdom collapse so completely and quickly? The sources suggest a society that had lost faith in itself. The integration of Goth and Roman, seemingly complete after Toledo, had perhaps gone too far. The Gothic military aristocracy had become indistinguishable from the Roman landowning class, more concerned with estates than warfare. The kingdom's armies were largely composed of poorly trained levies rather than the professional warriors who had faced Rome. The elaborate laws and sophisticated administration had created bureaucracy rather than strength. Moreover, for much of the population, Muslim rule initially seemed preferable to Gothic domination. Taxes were lower, religious freedom greater, trade opportunities expanded. Jews, persecuted under late Visigothic law, welcomed the Muslims as liberators. Peasants found their obligations reduced. Even many Christians found dhimmi status under Islam less onerous than the obligations imposed by Gothic aristocracy and Catholic hierarchy. The kingdom fell because few thought it worth saving. In the northern mountains of Asturias, a Gothic noble named Pelayo gathered the few who refused to submit. His force, perhaps 300 warriors, would win a skirmish at Covadonga that later legend would transform into the beginning of the Reconquista. But these were no longer really Goths. They were something new, the seeds of what would become Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan. The Gothic element would persist in bloodlines, in certain legal traditions, in fragments of art and architecture, but as constituent parts of new identities, rather than as anything distinctly Gothic. The last Visigothic coins were minted in 714 AD. The last documents written in Visigothic script date from a few decades later. The Gothic language, already nearly extinct, vanished completely. Within a generation of the conquest, it was as if the Goths had never ruled Spain. Their churches became mosques or were abandoned. Their palaces were demolished for building material. Their laws were superseded by Islamic jurisprudence. Even their graves were forgotten, the elaborate Gothic grave goods that marked their presence, becoming archaeological curiosities whose significance was lost. Echoes in stone. Walk through any European city, and you walk through Gothic shadows, though few recognise them as such. Not the Gothic of pointed arches and flying buttresses. That's a medieval innovation that borrowed the name but not the substance. The true Gothic legacy lies deeper in the very concept of cities that combine administrative function with sacred significance, in the placement of churches at the heart of urban spaces, in the integration of military and civil architecture. In Ravenna, Sant'Apollinare Nuovo preserves the palace church of Theodoric, though his image and those of his courtiers were chiseled from the mosaics by Byzantine reconquerors, leaving only their hands as ghostly reminders on the columns. The building itself speaks Gothic, architectural language, translated into Roman materials, the proportions that echo northern wooden halls, the decorative patterns that recall metalwork traditions, the emphasis on height that would later influence Romanesque builders. In Spain, the few surviving Visigothic churches, Santa Maria de Melque, San Pedro de la Nave, reveal an architectural tradition that bridged classical and medieval. The horseshoe arches, that would become characteristic of Moorish architecture, were actually a Visigothic innovation, adopted and perfected by Muslim builders. The alternating coloured stones, the geometric decoration, the play of light and shadow through carefully placed windows, all speak to a sophisticated aesthetic that synthesized multiple traditions. But perhaps the most profound Gothic influence on European architecture is invisible. The concept of buildings as expressions of cultural synthesis. Theodoric's palace complex in Ravenna, consciously combining Gothic and Roman elements, established a precedent for architectural fusion that would define European building for centuries. Every medieval cathedral that combines Romanesque solidity with Gothic verticality, every Renaissance palace that merges classical proportion with local tradition, owes something to the Gothic experiment in cultural combination. The Gothic contribution to architectural technology is equally significant, though rarely acknowledged. The timber framing techniques that Gothic builders brought from northern forests revolutionized construction in stone-poor regions. The metalwork that bound Gothic buildings, elaborate iron fixtures that were both functional and decorative, established traditions that would persist into the industrial age. Even the Gothic preference for polychrome decoration, using materials of different colours for aesthetic effect, would influence European architecture long after the Goths themselves were forgotten. The Gothic Renaissance. In the monastery of Streetgallen in 1700 AD, a scholar named Johannes Schilter carefully transcribes fragments of Wulfila's Bible, comparing Gothic words with German, Dutch, and English, tracing the genealogy of languages. He is part of a movement that will transform the forgotten Goths into symbols of Germanic pride, noble barbarians who conquered decadent Rome, carriers of racial vigour that renewed exhausted Mediterranean blood. This romanticisation has little to do with historical Goths, but everything to do with emerging European nationalism. The Gothic revival begins in scholarship, but quickly escapes academic boundaries. By 1750, Gothic origins are being claimed by Swedes, Germans, Spaniards, even English, each nation finding in the Goths ancestors who justify contemporary ambitions. The Gothic becomes a mirror in which Europeans see idealized versions of themselves. Martial virtue, uncorrupted by civilization, democratic traditions, older than classical republics, Christian faith, untainted by Roman corruption. In literature, the Gothic becomes synonymous with the medieval, the mysterious, the sublime. Gothic novels set in crumbling castles have nothing to do with actual Goths, but everything to do with European fascination with origins and decay. The word Gothic itself transforms, no longer referring to a historical people, but to an aesthetic of shadows and ruins, of passion breaking through rational constraints, of past haunting present. This romantic reimagining reaches its peak in the 19th century. Wagner's operas transform Gothic legends into nationalist mythology. Historians like Felix Dahn write massive novels that portray the Goths as tragic heroes, too noble for the corrupt world they conquered. The Gothic arch, which historical Goths never used, becomes the supreme expression of European spiritual aspiration. Universities are built in Gothic revival style to connect modern learning with imagined medieval wisdom. Even today, the Goths continue to be reinvented. In popular culture, they are Vikings before Vikings, barbarian warriors in fantasy films and video games. In scholarship, they are subjects for endless revision, each generation discovering new complexity in their interaction with Rome. In genetic studies, they are traced through haplogroups across Europe, their biological legacy mapped, though their cultural legacy remains disputed. The Goths have become what perhaps they always were, a projection screen for contemporary concerns about identity, migration, and cultural change. Children of the storm, the Gothic peoples vanished from history so completely that by the year 1000 AD, their very existence seemed more legend than fact. No Gothic kingdom survived, no population identified as Gothic. Their language was dead, preserved only in a single partial biblical manuscript that would not be rediscovered until the 16th century, yet they left traces everywhere, threads woven so deeply into the European fabric that they became invisible through ubiquity. In the legal systems of Spain and southern France, provisions derived from Visigothic law persisted for centuries, shaping concepts of property, inheritance, and justice. The Fuero Juzgo, the Romance translation of the Visigothic law code, remained legally binding in parts of Spain until the 19th century. Gothic concepts of personal law, where legal status followed bloodline rather than territory, influenced the development of medieval legal pluralism. Even today, Spanish legal traditions of community property and marriage echo Visigothic provisions that protected women's economic rights. The Gothic contribution to European aristocratic culture is equally profound, though rarely acknowledged. The Gothic warrior elite, with their emphasis on personal loyalty to leaders, their elaborate gift-giving economies, their fusion of military and governmental functions, provided templates for medieval feudalism. The concept of nobility, as both warrior class and administrative elite, distinct from both common soldiers and civilian bureaucrats, owes much to Gothic precedent. The very idea that barbarian birth could be elevated to equal or exceed Roman ancestry transformed European concepts of legitimacy. In language, Gothic ghosts whisper through modern European tongues. English war and ward, guard and warden, come from Gothic through various roots. Spanish words beginning with G, followed by ua, like Garda or Guante, mark Gothic linguistic influence. Italian place names ending in engo or ingo remember Gothic settlements. These are fossils of a vanished language, preserved in the mouths of peoples who never knew they were speaking Gothic words. But perhaps the deepest Gothic legacy lies in the transformation of Christianity, the Arian Christianity that Goths carried across Europe, though eventually defeated by Catholicism, forced the Church to clarify and defend its theological positions. The councils that condemned Arianism shaped Orthodox doctrine. The need to convert Gothic Arians promoted development of missionary techniques and vernacular religious instruction. Gothic Christianity, with its emphasis on Christ as divine warrior rather than suffering servant, influenced medieval Christian militarism. The Jesus who leads armies in medieval art owes something to Gothic theological imagination. The genetic legacy is most diffuse, but perhaps most pervasive. Across Spain, Italy, southern France, and the Balkans, Gothic DNA merged with local populations so thoroughly that distinct Gothic genetic markers vanished. Yet population genetics suggests that significant percentages of modern Europeans carry Gothic ancestry, unmarked and unrecognized. Every crowd in Madrid or Rome, Toulouse or Zagreb contains descendants of Gothic warriors and their families, people whose ancestors crossed the Danube in terror, stood at Adrianople, entered Rome with Alaric. Modern Europe's fascination with migration and integration finds strange echoes in Gothic history. The Goths were simultaneously successful and failed migrants, conquerors who were absorbed, transformers who were transformed. Their kingdoms lasted just long enough to reshape the classical world, but not long enough to maintain distinct identity. They were catalysts, more than creators, destroying old structures so new ones could emerge. In this, they offer neither simple lessons nor clear morals, only the complex reality of cultural encounter and ethnic transformation. As I speak these final words, the Gothic story dissolves into the larger narrative of European becoming. The storm that began in the northern forests, that swept across continents and centuries, finally exhausts itself. Its energy dissipated but not destroyed, transformed into the very atmosphere of medieval and modern Europe. The Goths achieved a kind of immortality they could never have imagined, not as a people or kingdom, but as an essential ingredient in the emergence of the post-Roman world. I'm grateful you've accompanied me through these historical landscapes tonight. Rest well beneath the starlit skies of ancient nights.